Hi, you're on the channel Nomad of Dreams. Today I will talk about the philosophy of Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy. The topic concerns the moral foundations of life: conscience, sincerity, love, and simplicity as practical guides. This is important because it is about how a person turns thoughts into actions and how the inner voice shapes the meaning of existence. Where are you listening from and what time is it for you now? Write in the comments. I like to see where people come from and when they tune in. Take a deep breath, feel your shoulders. Try to even out your breathing rhythm. This will help you listen more attentively. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy is a thinker who places moral demandingness at the center of a philosophy of life. His approach focuses on norms of behavior and on seeing the world through the question of honesty toward oneself and others. This model of thought remains relevant because it concerns direct experiences of duty, suffering, and compassion, not speculative constructions. The essence of his reflections is clear and aimed at the practical transformation of the person, which makes the ideas applicable in everyday life. One of the key concepts is conscience as a moral law. For Tolstoy, conscience is not simply a moral feeling, but an inner voice that sets the measure of actions and requires their proportionality to what a person recognizes as true and good. This inner voice has a prescriptive force. It addresses not intellectual arguments, but the immediate sense of duty. To hear conscience is to encounter a demand to change motives and behavior, and this experience is often accompanied by a feeling of guilt or shame when an action turns out to be incompatible with the inner rule. The function of conscience in Tolstoy is twofold. It simultaneously reveals moral truth and demands practical correction of life. In one aspect, conscience is perceived as a criterion of truth, that which makes an act authentic within the bounds of personal responsibility. In another aspect, it acts as a driver of change. A person who recognizes the incompatibility of their actions with the demand of conscience finds themselves called to inner transformation. Thus, conscience becomes not a formula for discussion, but a living force that turns knowledge of good into action. The moral force of conscience manifests in its immediate authoritativeness. The command of conscience is not expressed in abstract rules. It sounds like an inner demand that seldom lends itself to rational debate. This demand can be simple and strict at the same time: to do what seems right, even if external conditions do not support that choice. Such a character of conscience explains its central role in Tolstoy's ethical system. Morality ceases to be an external norm and becomes an impulse that shapes a way of life. The connection of conscience with love is another important aspect. For Tolstoy, love appears as the criterion for evaluating an action. An act is righteous when it springs from love for one's neighbor. Conscience indicates not only what is forbidden, but also which actions to take when love functions as the motive. In this sense, conscience works as an interpreter of feelings, turning compassion into concrete behavioral demands. The sincerity of motive makes an action truly moral, because the outward act acquires depth if it arises from an inner impulse to love. The embodiment of conscience in everyday decisions generates a series of practical consequences. Conscience shapes habits of honesty and simplicity. It reduces readiness to compromise in ways that contradict the inner sense of duty. Under the influence of conscience, attitudes toward authority, rituals, and social norms change, since the main point of reference for evaluating actions shifts inward to the person. This makes moral life a matter of constant inner work, not external rule following. At the same time, The character of conscience has its own internal dynamics. The experience of guilt and shame functions not only as punishment, but as a motivator for correction. The suffering of recognizing wrongdoing stimulates renunciation of former behavioral patterns and the search for deeper grounds for action. Such a process of transformation requires humility and labor on oneself. It is not easy and presupposes continuous moral effort. Tolstoy links conscience with the notion of revelation as a normative impulse. This revelation is not formal or ceremonial. It appears as a sudden clarity in which it becomes visible what to consider good and what an action should be. Revelation functions as a criterion that tests previous beliefs and points the way to stricter conformity between word and deed. The importance of this procedure lies in the fact that it makes morality not something prescribed by someone else, but something personally experienced and assimilated. Conscience is not without limitations. Its voice can be muffled by habits, fears, attachments, and false interpretations of virtue. That is why attention to the nature of conscience requires transparency of motivation and constant self-analysis. Working on conscience implies developing the ability to hear this inner law and to distinguish its demands from psychological and cultural noise. Reflections on conscience continue in the following considerations, where I will more closely examine how the inner voice forms practical rules of behavior, how it affects spheres of public life, and what conditions are necessary for this voice to be heard clearly and demandingly. I will describe the nature of conscience and its normative force in order to understand how an inner law turns into concrete ethical practice. Conscience appears as an internal moral law indicating what to consider a duty and what an action should be. It acts as a personal imperative. It does not advise from a distance, but demands an immediate response, requires integrity of motive and responsibility for the result. Conscience sets the measure for actions when external rules are silent or when social norms do not provide a clear guide. It forms the criterion by which a person is both judge and executor for themselves. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy saw in this law the core of moral life, a force capable of reorienting all other motives. The mechanism of conscience works like an internal filter. It takes in information about what is happening, relates it to deep-seated notions of good, and evokes an emotional response that appears as anxiety, shame, or calm assurance. This response is not reducible to an intellectual conclusion. It touches the will and the body, prompting immediate change of intentions and actions. The crucial point is the transition from feeling to the decision to act. Conscience does not merely register the discrepancy between desire and ideal. It mobilizes energy for correction, sometimes quietly, sometimes demandingly, but always aimed at overcoming the divergence between the inner rule and the outward deed. Where does the voice we call conscience originate? And how can it be trusted? The formation of the internal law is linked to the experience of attending to the consequences of one's actions, to the development of the capacity to empathize, and to the readiness to acknowledge one's own mistake. Conscience strengthens in practices where a person learns to listen to themselves honestly, in work on habits, in repeated checking of motives, in openness to criticism, and to the inner embarrassment when it arises. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy emphasized that conscience develops through practical work on oneself, not as abstract contemplation, but as a constant testing of the conformity of behavior to deep convictions. Often the voice of conscience is drowned out by habits and self-justifications, and then the appearance of moral purity proves superficial. The distortion of motive happens gradually. First, the justification seems small. Then it expands into a way of life. Recognizing such a process requires honest self-assessment and disciplined attention. When you deliberately check the reasons for your actions and listen to the experience of guilt, not as punishment, but as a signal to change course, conscience gradually regains the authority of its simple but strict logic. Act so that you do not be ashamed of your motives before yourself. The limits of the internal law's operation are expressed in a number of circumstances. In intense fear and violence that suppress the voice. In cultural rituals that create habitual justifications. In chronic fatigue and stress that reduce the capacity for reflection. In intellectual pride that refuses to acknowledge simple moral demands. These limitations also appear when the moral ideal remains abstract and is not translated into daily practices. For conscience to function as a law, conditions are needed that make it audible and obeyed. Honesty with oneself, the habit of self-criticism, minimization of coercive factors, and time for silent reflection. The link between the internal law and public life is formed through personal transformation. When conscience becomes a stable force, it changes attitudes toward authority, everyday compromises, and the role of rituals. The priority of internal responsibility leads to external prescriptions being measured by a personal sense of duty. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy interpreted this shift as a relocation of the moral center of gravity into the person. The concept of good ceases to be an external set of rules and turns into a practical discipline of self-governance and love for one's neighbor. The practical significance of such an understanding of conscience lies in the fact that morality ceases to be a theoretical school and becomes a matter of everyday labor. Conscience as a law requires concrete exercises, tracking motivation, correcting habitual deviations, refusing justifications, and then the inner voice learns to clearly recognize the good. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy proposed precisely this path, not declarations, but the transformation of life through constant work on oneself, through bringing words into accord with deeds. This approach remains relevant for those who strive for morality to be not an external condition, but an organic part of personal existence. This does not imply secluded asceticism or loss of connection with the world. On the contrary, the power of conscience manifests in simple contacts, an honest conversation, a kept promise, refusal of a small lie, attention to the weak. These microactions accumulate and create a field of trust, in which social norms cease to be external pressure and become an extension of the inner law. Cultivating conscience requires models and space for practice. Families, schools, workplaces where honesty is encouraged, and moral responsibility is discussed without humiliation and fear. Tolstoy warned that conscience cannot be taught by command. Its formation requires example and an invitation to reflection. The key element is humility before one's own imperfection. By acknowledging one's mistakes, a person makes possible a genuine dialogue between desire and the demand of conscience. In this, moral maturity awakens, not the power of rules, but the readiness to answer for the consequences of one's deeds. Conscience, being a living force, needs nourishment. Habits of conscientiousness, honesty with others, and constant exercise of attentiveness. Such practice can be developed consciously, keeping a journal of motivations, discussing difficult choices with a mentor, practicing forgiveness and sincere admission of guilt. Ultimately, conscience is a bridge between a person's inner world and the quality of public life. When many individuals make this bridge strong, society gains a moral support that does not require violence. This is one of Tolstoy's ideas. Moral progress requires the transformation of individual lives, and this is a path for everyone. Violence is present in life as a habitual tool for resolving conflicts, as a means of defending interests, and as a mechanism for maintaining order. It appears in everyday quarrels, in family rules, in the structure of courts and armies, in the legitimacy of a power that relies on the threat of coercion. When inflicting harm becomes an acceptable strategy, the moral landscape contracts. The ability to see another person as of equal worth is lost, and motivations to act for a good outcome of a different kind begin to be measured by the efficiency of force. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy believed that the very logic of applying force destroys the moral foundations of society. This ruined fabric gives rise to closed chains of revenge and defensive gesture, where each action produces a response and humanity slips away. The criterion by which one can evaluate behavior in institutions is the refusal to cause harm and the search for ways to resolve conflicts that create life and dignity for both participants. Nonviolence here is understood as an active moral stance that requires inner discipline and readiness to take responsibility for consequences. It allows for courageous speech, honest actions, and the demand for love as a practical method of interaction. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy introduced this rule not as an abstract virtue, but as a practical law of conduct. Any action is judged by whether it reduces suffering and increases respect for the person. You can recognize such a criterion in everyday decisions, in how to speak criticism, how to organize work, how to protect the weak while preserving their human dignity. Adopting nonviolence changes lifestyle and the structure of social relations. At the individual level, this means a readjustment of motives. Actions are performed not to win over another, but to preserve relationships and honor. This requires strength of character and the ability to endure frustration, because renouncing violence demands other means of influence: persuasion, example, patient labor. At the societal level, the criterion of nonviolence pushes toward reforms. The justice system shifts emphasis from retribution to restoration. Educational practices pay attention to cultivating empathy and responsibility, and politics becomes a measure of readiness to conduct dialogue instead of displaying force. The consistency of this approach yields another type of legitimacy of power. It is based on trust and voluntary consent, not on fear of punishment. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy linked this with the idea of transforming public space through personal example and the mass practice of non-resistance to evil. A small case illustrates the point. If, in an argument, you hold your tongue against insult and choose to admit weakness, the conflict often loses its dynamics and ceases to escalate. Such an action seems simple, but it requires courage and self-restraint, and sends a signal to the world that issues are resolved not by inflicting pain. The long-term consequences of such practices form a norm of behavior that cultivates generations of people able to listen and to take responsibility for the consequences of their words and deeds. Certain limits condition the application of the nonviolence criterion. There are situations of immediate threat to life where inaction that fails to stop aggression leads to unacceptable harm. There are social mechanisms that operate through coercion and at the moment cannot be rapidly replaced by peaceful practices. Armies and law enforcement bodies oriented toward instant control. Economic interests tied to exploitation. Cultural contexts where harsh norms are entrenched. The limit of the principle's manifestation is visible when the only way to protect the vulnerable is through forceful intervention if there are no institutions capable of offering alternatives. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy recognized these difficulties and insisted that the renunciation of violence requires deep restructuring of practices and thinking, not the instantaneous imposition of a universal recipe. As long as the criterion remains an ideal without practical reinforcement, its influence will be limited to the personal morality of individuals. To expand its reach requires systemic work, teaching empathy from early years, creating procedures for peaceful conflict resolution, developing institutions oriented toward restoration rather than retribution. Nonviolence needs organized discipline and an understanding of responsibility for the consequences of one's refusal to use force. Without these conditions, it risks becoming a gesture of personal moral stance, incapable of stopping structural violence. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy proposed beginning with inner transformation, while at the same time investing in public practice so that private changes grow into collective reality. The conclusion is that nonviolence as a criterion offers a clear moral orientation and a practical plan of action that requires strength, education, and institutional support. This criterion asks us to view every decision through the lens of reducing harm and respecting the person, acknowledges the need for courage and structural changes, and at the same time indicates the boundary where swift measures to protect life are needed and where public infrastructure still does not provide peaceful alternatives. Accepting such a rule is a task for one person and for many people at once. It is a path that requires constant work on oneself and the courage to transform one's surroundings. The mechanism of institutional religion is built on a set of stable rituals, symbols, and vertical ties of authority. Repeated actions and words consolidate a shared worldview, give it the appearance of inevitability, and pass it from generation to generation. Governing bodies direct the interpretation of sacred texts and control access to sacred practices, creating boundaries of what is permissible in faith and behavior. This structure is accompanied by material resources and organizational infrastructure that make religious life visible and tangible in everydayness. Why such a mechanism is needed is clear in social conditions of uncertainty. People seek support for big questions about meaning, truth, and good, and institutions offer an ordered language for these searches. Rituals fix attention on shared values, and congregations provide support in grief and joy, ensuring a network of trust and help. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy saw in religious communities a potential for moral education and supported the idea that faith can work as a force that shapes character and duties toward one's neighbor. Where this mechanism breaks down becomes noticeable when the organization begins to dominate moral content. Ritual is repeated for its own form. Verbal formulas replace real experience, and the authority of official interpreters becomes a condition of belonging. Power, concentrated in the hands of leaders, receives incentives to protect itself and its positions, uses institutional strength to preserve status, and often turns the church into a mechanism for maintaining public order or political interests. Then religious life becomes a habitual set of actions that reduce the space for personal responsibility. The mechanism of legitimation, when the church establishes what is right and what is forbidden, operates through education, through control of culture, and through the right to define moral norms. This mechanism is economically efficient. It reduces uncertainty, creates rules for communal life, and simplifies conflict resolution. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy pointed to the danger when such legitimation begins to suppress the inner voice of conscience, because external norms are accepted without internal processing and critique. What happens to conscience in conditions where external forms replace internal responsibility is an important question. Conscience loses its practical skill of discernment if a person becomes accustomed to trusting directives from outside. Over time, the capacity to make difficult moral decisions personally and to bear responsibility for them weakens. This leads to moral dilemmas being solved by template, and benevolent forms can serve as a cover for actions that do not reduce suffering and sometimes multiply it. The reasons for such a skew are linked to basic social logic. Organizations strive for stability, and for this they need rules, authorities, and rituals. The institution includes both economic incentives and a personnel hierarchy, and coordinated practices that are easily reproduced. The consequences manifest in the formation of a corporate ethic that shuts itself off from criticism both outside and inside, and in the gradual rejection of those people for whom faith has become a matter of personal searching. This analytical trio shows that for the institution to remain alive, it must support both the system and inner freedom. Why organizations need the institution-spirituality link remains a practical challenge. A proper religious structure helps preserve tradition, organize aid, and teach skills of empathy. Ideally, the ministry of temples and communities should awaken in people the ability to listen to themselves and others, to develop the habit of self-examination and of sincere seeking of the good. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy insisted that the church should be an instrument of moral awakening when it strengthens personal responsibility rather than suppressing it. Where attempts to hold both sides together most often break down is visible in political entanglement and in collective defensive practices. State support turns religion into a structure that legitimizes power, and then moral demands bend to political tasks. Within communities, a fear of doubt arises because doubts are perceived as a threat to unity. This hinders reforms and blocks renewal that comes through critical rethinking of practices and through a willingness to admit mistakes. The mechanism for restoring trust is simple in principle and difficult in execution. It requires returning the emphasis to the cultivation of inner conscience through education, through the example of an honest life, and through open forms of leaders' accountability to the community. You can see how changes begin to happen where worship and service to people are joined, where words are tested by deeds, and where power is subject to transparent scrutiny. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy proposed a path of personal transformation tied to social example, pointing out that changes begin with small practices of sincerity. The conclusion is that institutional religion, as a mechanism, is indispensable for maintaining the social fabric, but its value is determined by how much it develops personal morality rather than replacing it. Where structures strengthen inner responsibility, they fulfill their role and give people a language for the good. Where organization serves to preserve power for its own sake, religion degrades into a function of control. Restoring meaning requires work on two levels simultaneously: strengthening institutions that cultivate conscience and personal readiness to live in accordance with what you proclaim. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy believed that this path is difficult, but the only fruitful one, because faith that has not become a matter of the heart remains an empty form. What is sincerity in art, and why does it demand from the artist more than technical mastery and the ability to impress an audience? Sincerity is a direct transmission of inner experience through form and word. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy believed that art should be a means of communication between souls, not a way to adorn life or provide entertainment. When an artist writes or creates an image, their task is not to invent striking devices for the sake of a spectator's reaction, but to give the experience in its density and temperature. This means recording not only external details, but also the subtle inner movements of consciousness, doubts, small shifts of the heart, that very test of honesty that makes the word alive. How to achieve this truth of experience in a text or a painting? First, honesty requires clarity of relation to oneself. The artist must be ready to name what they feel, without hiding motivation and without masking contradictions with pretty metaphors. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy emphasized that the personal sincerity of the author is transmitted to the reader and makes the work effective. Technique is important as a means of transmission, but methodical command of the craft without an inner fire gives a smooth but empty surface. Truthfulness is achieved through the union of inner clarity and external form, through the discipline of observation that can notice the small things connected to the large moral temperature of the text. Next comes the question of criteria for this sincerity. How to check that the work is genuinely authentic? One working guideline is that the work elicits a response in you, awakens the conscience, and leaves a trace. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy spoke of a sense of community with the author. If the author has discovered some inner truth and shared it honestly, the reader will feel a sense of participation. I have noticed this in short prose passages where economy of words and refusal of rhetoric produce a stronger impression than pompous scenes. From this follows the demand that language be precise in describing experience, not merely striking. Turning to the construction of artistic truth, it is useful to consider reasons why sincerity is sometimes lost. Social and career incentives steer many authors toward the search for external devices. An artist may begin to orient toward reviews, audience expectations, a stable style that sells. Under such conditions, inner honesty weakens. Mechanisms for restoring truth in art include the habit of self-examination, work on attention to one's own experience, and honest speech about the motives of creativity. The consequence of such practice is a work that acts not by form, but by inner content, and it preserves its connection longer with those who are willing to listen. Developing the theme requires discussing the limits of the claim to sincerity. Sincerity is not an automatic guarantee of the moral significance of a work. The truthfulness of experience can exist in a work that describes dubious or dangerous passions. The mere truth of the experience does not make the subject good or commendable. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy was interested in how art affects morals and proceeded from the idea that the work that honestly conveys love of the good and compassion shapes the social field differently than one that cleverly imitates emotion. Nevertheless, each historical era and each reader add their fragment of interpretation, and the artist must accept that the audience's response does not always coincide with their intention. The role of form in conveying the truth of experience cannot be underestimated. Words, rhythm, composition, tone of the image work as a vessel that either holds the content or deforms it. Sometimes the simplest constructions convey more deeply because they do not distract from the center of experience. In the artist's work, technique serves the ethics of the work. The choice of words, scene, detail is a moral choice. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy saw a connection between form and the moral force of a work, and demanded honesty from art as a requisite condition of its educative influence. What does the encounter with a sincere work mean for you? It is an encounter that puts you in a situation of inner examination. You experience a resonance that forces you to revise part of your assumptions. You feel doubt and awaken a sense of responsibility. An artist who has achieved such honesty becomes an intermediary between their own experience and someone else's life. This mediation contains both power and responsibility, the power to change understanding of the world and the responsibility to answer for the consequences of the influence. The boundary of the demand for sincerity runs along the ability of a work to evoke a genuine experience in the one who perceives it. Sincerity cannot be instituted administratively or prescribed by school rules. It is born in the honesty of the creator themselves, in their readiness to admit falseness when it appears, and in the ability to work on a language that can contain pain and joy without theatricality. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy believed that art that does not awaken conscience and does not convey the truth of the heart loses its purpose. Therefore, for the artist, sincerity is not a fashion or a technical rule, but a constant practical task to live so that word and image reflect inner truth. The consequence of this re-evaluation of history is obvious. The notion of the past ceases to be a theater of solitary superhuman acts and becomes a map of many ordinary causes through which the course of events is formed. When historical action is read as a network of interactions among people, habits, institutions, and contingencies, the moral language changes too. In the interest of evaluating the past, a finer scale of responsibility appears. Questions are no longer reduced to glorifying a particular feat, but directed at examining which conditions and practices produced a given humanitarian dynamic. Such a shift moves the emphasis away from the heroic gesture toward analysis of the processes that make the gesture possible. As a result, historical knowledge ceases to serve as justification for personal greatness and becomes a tool for understanding the mechanics of change. The reason for this shift in Tolstoy's thought lies in his striving to see the causal web of life. Tolstoy believed that events do not grow out of the will of one person as from a source, but arise from the combination of countless causes, economic, psychological, everyday, and accidental. This observation grows out of the practice of attentive description of society, where every little thing can change a trajectory. Tolstoy at the same time posed an ethical question: on what is the moral legitimation of historical teachings that ascribe victory to a single name built? The study of causality and the anxiety about the moral consequences of attributing omnipotence to individual persons pushed him to reject the heroic narrative as the primary key to the past. Clarification is important for clarity. Recognizing mass causes does not erase the significance of the human person as a bearer of motivations and feelings. A person remains an actor, but their action turns out to be embedded in a system of circumstances, habits, and roles. In this sense, the moral view shifts from evaluating individual acts to evaluating the conditions that make such acts probable or inevitable. One must distinguish analysis of processes from shirking responsibility onto circumstances. Tolstoy's mental churn consists in the fact that to understand and remedy evil, one must see both how conditions are formed and how people act and react within these conditions. Such an approach opens a field for practice. Changing habits, institutions, and everyday rituals has real power to influence history. The tie to Tolstoy's creativity is visible in the way he constructed his novels and essays. He described crowds, invertedly arranged scenes, chains of barely noticeable decisions and shifts that accumulate to a historical effect. On the level of artistic method, this means rejecting a plot center that pulls the whole fabula along, in favor of many centers, each of which is important as a factor in the overall picture. Tolstoy used this method to show the connection between the particular and the general, personal motive and social background, and thereby developed a model useful not only to the artist, but to the thinking historian as well. A further consequence of this reading is how attitudes toward responsibility for social evils change. With attention to mass causes, the emphasis is placed on collective morality. It is important to understand which habitual practices in everyday life, at work and in governance, create conditions for systemic harm, and to work on changing them. This does not grant amnesty for personal crimes. Rather, it expands the field of intervention. Prevention of evil requires changes in organizational procedures, educational models, and economic relations. And here Tolstoy's practical orientation appears. He sought precisely the points at which moral influence is possible and effective. A brief example. The outcome of a war is made up of dozens of small decisions. Information exchanges, logistics, delays, and accidental losses. Such a picture shows that changes are possible through changing practices and connections, not only through changing people at the top of the hierarchy. Clarifying the limits of the method helps avoid illusions.
Analysis of causality does not turn into an apology for determinism and does not diminish the value of moral choice. Rather, it requires from us a more responsible attitude toward habits and toward what is considered normal. Tolstoy, while criticizing heroic history, emphasized the importance of inner work on conscience and character. To understand the scale of causes means to understand where systemic reforms are needed and where a deep moral restructuring of the person is necessary. Both directions become mutually complementary. Tolstoy's causal view places demands both on the writing of history and on its reception. A historical text must be able to show the complexity of interactions without pinning the explanation on a personality. The reader becomes accustomed to noticing links between economy, culture, everyday life, and major political shifts. This changes the emotional stance. Eyes learn to see a multiplicity of causes, and the sense of justice learns to seek solutions in changing infrastructures and customs, not in finding a single culprit or hero. The tie to the present sounds direct. If you look at current conflicts through the lens of eponymous heroes, you risk missing those mechanisms that require intervention. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy offers a different tool, a careful analytical habit that seeks causal chains and small practices. It is important to develop the ability to see the influence of invisible routines, to catch how the everyday accumulates into the historical. Concluding the thought, I note that Tolstoy's rejection of heroic history is a moral and methodological turn. It makes history available for practical intervention. If major events consist of many small causes, change is possible in the places where those causes are reproduced.
Working on institutions, education, habits, and attention to everyday life becomes a task no less important than cultivating individual heroes. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy suggests that historical understanding, combined with moral obligation, provides a field for transformations that depend on you and on many similar everyday decisions. A particular case of the ethics of simplicity manifests in a person who consciously reduces the circle of desires and obligations, and through this liberation gains clarity of intention. Such purification of everyday life changes the order of thoughts. Fewer things require less protection and explanation. Fewer obligations reduce the need for masks and justifications. As a result, attention becomes freer for questions about what to be and how to act, rather than how to maintain an image. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy described this process not as an aesthetic whim, but as a path to inner straightforwardness, when life is organized around a moral aim rather than around accumulation. The conclusion from this particular case is simple. Minimizing external distractions works as an instrument of moral concentration. A mind not scattered by endless desires better hears the voice of conscience, ready to make decisions corresponding to love and responsibility. Everyday simplicity facilitates the practice of good habits because it reduces the number of situations where the temptation of self-justification becomes convenient. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy saw in this a way to strengthen the will and reduce the likelihood of self-deception. If we generalize, the ethics of simplicity appears as a systemic principle of life, not an isolated behavior.
The essence of the principle is that reducing needs changes the structure of a person's motivations and therefore their role in society. The mechanism is as follows. Fewer desires lead to changed habits. Changed habits form a different character. A different character makes possible different social practices. This influence spreads from personal, everyday life to institutions because habits multiply and consolidate through repeated actions. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy believed that personal simplicity can affect society when it becomes an example and a stimulus for restructuring mass norms. Why is such restructuring important for morality and for the order of life? When social practices are oriented toward excessive consumption and external symbols of success, motivation for honesty and compassion weakens. You can notice this in the waning attention to neighbors, in the readiness to sacrifice the quality of communication for ostentatious comfort. The principle of simplicity returns the question of values to everyday decisions: what to buy, how to spend time, which rituals to maintain. This has a direct influence on upbringing, on work, on the form of social relations. Analytically, this can be described as a triad. Source of influence, the desire to cut the excess for clarity. Structure of the process, replacing scattered habits with stable, simple practices. Consequences, a reduction of internal conflict, strengthening readiness for moral action, and the possibility of changing collective standards. Such a scheme explains why personal changes prove effective. They operate at the level of repeatable practices that cumulatively form culture. That is why Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy emphasized the importance of constant, modest work on oneself rather than spectacular gestures. Generalizing to the societal level shows that the ethics of simplicity affects the economy of attention and the distribution of resources. If many people cut unnecessary expenditures and reallocate time to education, communication, and labor, this reduces pressure on natural and social systems. Ideals in culture change. The value of display gives way to the value of meaning. However, such changes do not happen automatically. For their sustainable consolidation, institutions are required that encourage simple practices and know how to support those who choose a different way of life. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy sees here a task of collective responsibility. Simplicity must not be an exoticism for the few, but should become an accessible norm. The limitation of this model is visible on two planes. The first plane is personal. Excessive simplification easily slips into a form of self-isolation or moral rigorism, when the renunciation of external well-being becomes a refuge from social obligations. The second plane is institutional. An individual's simplicity will not remove structural injustices if economic and political mechanisms continue to reproduce scarcity and exploitation. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy
acknowledge the need for balance between inner transformation and work on living conditions, because only the combination of these efforts makes genuine moral progress possible. The practical boundary concerns the way the idea is implemented in life. Adopting simplicity requires learning and support. Habits change through repetition and through a revaluation of what is considered important. The changes of a single person at the level of everyday life are useful when accompanied by exchange of experience, collective practices, and changes in educational tasks. A solitary drive toward asceticism without social support remains a personal story and easily loses transformative power. Concluding the thought, I will say that the ethics of simplicity, according to Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy, is not only a personal choice, but a method of moral influence on society. It offers a path in which changing everyday habits becomes a form of resistance to the squandering of values and a way to strengthen the place of conscience in life. You can start small, reconsider your habits, free up time for reflection and compassion, and through this small shift enter a network of broader transformations. The main limit here is clear. Simplicity alone will not replace just institutions, but it creates the environment in which an honest social contract becomes possible. Love serves as a practical criterion for choosing actions. If at the turning point of a decision you put the question of whether an action brings a person closer to caring for their neighbor and reducing their suffering, then morality becomes measurable. This rule implies that love is not merely a feeling, but an orientation in action. It requires concrete steps that reflect respect for another's dignity and a readiness not to look away from their need. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy interpreted love as a primary impulse that is translated into a way of life and into practical decisions. In this position, love means attentiveness to real needs, a duty toward the person, not an aesthetic experience. It manifests itself in a willingness to listen, in the ability to act when necessary, and in patience when the result takes time. Love is essentially linked to responsibility. It refers to the one who suffers and to what can be done to help without multiplying dependence. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy insisted that sincere love requires a transformation of character, and that transformation is manifested in repeated actions. The practical criterion comes into play in a simple daily question. Does this act make the neighbor less lonely, less vulnerable, more capable of independent life? You can evaluate decisions by 3 scales. The first scale is immediate benefit, a real reduction of pain or deprivation. The second scale is respect. Does the action preserve the person's dignity? Does it not turn help into power over them? The third scale is sustainability. Does the action contribute to developing abilities that will allow the person to manage without constant supervision in the future? These criteria turn love into a tool of practical assessment, available in everyday life. Tension arises from the fact that love requires concrete sacrifices and often conflicts with habitual duties. There are situations when duty is set by a profession, when institutional rules require formal compliance, and one must find the point of contact with the demand to love. Love asks to interrupt the accustomed sequence of advantages and conveniences. It asks for time, simple presence, often steady, irritating, and inconvenient labor. It is here that moral burden appears. Love runs up against fatigue, economic constraints, and the expectations of those around. Another source of tension is the tendency to mistake feelings for love. Often, gestures are made that masquerade as care, but actually serve self-affirmation, the search for approval, or the desire to control. In such cases, the criterion of love is drowned out by routine motives and habitual moral relaxation. Outwardly, everything may look like kindness, while inside, it continues old selfishness disguised as generosity. This gives rise to doubts. How to distinguish pure motivation from a self-sustaining illusion? The problem becomes more complicated when love encounters the system. Social institutions operate through rules, sanctions, and the allocation of resources. Love is oriented toward a particular person. Institutions are oriented toward general principles. Friction often arises between these orientations. An efficient bureaucratic response may not meet the needs of a specific individual, while a sincere act of love may violate formal norms. Resolving such a conflict requires not simplification, but creativity. Finding ways in which institutions support manifestations of love, while love takes into account the need for order and justice. The way out of this tension lies in cultivating certain skills and habits. The first skill is the ability to diagnose real need, to recognize where intervention is required and where simple attention is enough. The second skill is the willingness to act regularly, even when the action is modest and not demonstrative. The third is readiness for self-criticism, to check one's motives and not allow oneself to make excuses. These elements turn love into practice. It ceases to be an episodic impulse and becomes a constant direction of life. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy viewed such practice as a process of inner work that changes the regimen of thoughts and the body. At the level of everyday practices, this means plain simplicity of actions. Reconsider the hours of your day. How much time is spent on displaying status and how much on real relationships? Include in your routine moments when you intentionally give time to those nearby, without aiming to receive anything in return. This is discipline, but discipline reinforced by love, not formal obligation. Authorities and rules must be related to the criterion of care. If a rule does not improve people's lives, if it hinders their freedom and autonomy, the task of the person who loves is to seek a way to change it, so that respect for the common order is combined with protection of the individual. Spreading love at the institutional level requires translating practice into habits of collective arrangement. Education, professional training, resource management, and law must include assessment by the criterion of care. How does a decision affect those who are most vulnerable? This is not an abstract slogan, but concrete support measures, allocation of time and resources that allow people to develop the capacity for mutual help. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy saw the meaning of personal moral work in its social echo. Love, strengthened as habit, changes the structure of interactions. The boundaries of applying such a criterion are important and obvious. Love does not absolve one of responsibility before law and justice. It does not justify ignoring consequences, and does not require self-annihilation for another. Love presupposes the preservation of one's own dignity and clarity of purpose. Its strength lies in directing actions towards strengthening autonomy and reducing suffering, not in absorbing the personality into total self-sacrifice. Limitation implies the practice of sober calculation of conscience, where love is accompanied by wisdom and concern for long-term consequences. The approach that proposes to translate love into a criterion demands discipline and honesty from you. Ask yourself simple questions before acting. Whom does this act truly benefit? Does it preserve dignity? Does it teach self-reliance? Do a small experiment. For several days in a row, perform actions motivated by a readiness to lessen someone else's pain, and watch the result. I have seen how the habit of such attention changes communication and opens new possibilities for help. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy called for continual work on oneself, and this continual work is precisely the way to turn love into a practical criterion of morality. I propose a simple conclusion. Measure your deeds by love, catch the tension it causes, and answer with a steady practice. This is a path of discipline and trials, a path of character transformation, and the move from words to daily duties toward the neighbor. If you begin to live by such a rule, it will gradually reorganize not only your personal regimen, but also the field of social interaction, making concern for the person the measure of a good life. Law and conscience lie in different registers. The first outlines the boundaries of behavior from the outside. The second indicates the measure of action from within. This contrast is immediately apparent, but it is important to preserve precision of speech and not reduce one to the negation of the other. Law forms order and predictability. Conscience forms personal responsibility and an inner obligation toward the person. Conscience is presented as a voice that demands an answer here and now. It is not a sum of prescriptions. It is a demand to understand who is actually being harmed and how the situation can be changed to reduce that harm.
Conscience asks for honesty with oneself, attention to the details of another's life, a willingness not to close one's eyes to what is happening. It measures an act by the scale of dignity and by the scale of the person's ability to live independently. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy emphasizes the autonomy of moral action. Inner duty becomes the highest norm that sets the direction of the act. For Tolstoy, morality is not an external set of rules imposed from above. It is a state of the soul, an ability to hear and fulfill the demand of conscience. That is why, for Tolstoy, conscience often functions as a criterion for evaluating any external laws and institutions. A real-life case helps to feel the problem. An official receives an order to formalize the eviction of a family. He can carry out the formality and sign a document that will destroy someone's support. Another person, guided by conscience, hearing the voice about the harm, will stop, investigate, look for a way to soften the decision and preserve human dignity. This example is simple, but it clearly shows that in the field of conscience, a mere legal order comes up against human responsibility. The conflict between personal moral responsibility and public order requires a clear understanding of consequences. When a person is guided by conscience, they assume not only moral obligation, but also responsibility for the social effects of their choice. The autonomy of conscience does not exempt one from calculation and attention to long-term results. A volitional act dictated by inner conviction needs wisdom so as not to harm those it tries to save. The political aspect of this topic becomes evident when laws that justify violence are at issue. Law can be an instrument of order and at the same time a means of oppression if it lacks moral content. Tolstoy saw that state power based solely on legal legitimacy loses deep moral support. The position of conscience here appears as a demand to refuse participation in mechanisms that multiply suffering and encroach on human dignity. The threshold of conscience needs to be checked, because the inner voice can be distorted by habits, prejudices, social fears. Self-criticism and honest examination of motives become necessary practices. Acknowledging that inner certainty is not always equal to moral truth means developing the art of listening and measuring personal attitudes against respect for the other. Love in this test serves as a reliable indicator. An act that reduces suffering and strengthens autonomy receives the affirmation of conscience. Developing conscience requires methods and discipline. Observing one's motives, the habit of postponing automatic action, and checking whom it harms or helps, systematic practice of compassion, learning to take responsibility for consequences. All this trains the internal measure. Educating conscience in school and family should include practical exercises where a child learns to see concrete need and accept the consequences of choice.
It is through upbringing that the ability to act according to conscience without destroying social ties is formed. Institutions can and should develop so as to respect the space of conscience. This means building procedures that take into account exceptional human circumstances, implementing mechanisms that allow formal decisions to be adjusted in favor of preserving dignity. At the same time, people guided by conscience bear the burden of explaining their actions to society and being ready to bear legal consequences. Conscious dissent to the law requires readiness to accept that personal conviction places you both in the position of a teacher and in the position of a defendant. The point is simple and decisive. Conscience is an internal judge that gives moral force and meaning to action. Work on the ability to hear it, systematically check motives, and learn to combine courage with calculation. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy shows that moral autonomy becomes a real force when it is accompanied by discipline, love, and willingness to answer for consequences. If you accept conscience as the main guide, your actions will begin to change both you and the institutions in which you live. But it is important to remember, conscience must not become an excuse for egoism or self-assured moral rigorism. True moral practice implies dialogue with the neighbor, with the law, with history. A dialogue in which we are ready to change our views if they cause harm, and where conviction is tested by facts and the experience of others. The practice of conscience requires patience with doubts and readiness to bear consequences, as well as the wisdom to distinguish when it is better to act openly and when to seek ways of reconciliation. Social change begins with individual acts, but does not end with them. Integrating conscience into public processes implies creating channels for the voices of conscientious people, mechanisms for transparent discussion, and institutions ready to take moral argumentation into account.
Thus, conscience ceases to be merely an inner feeling and becomes a force capable of inspiring reform, strengthening solidarity, and protecting human dignity. Test your conscience and learn to follow it with respect for the world we build together. Courage and humility are necessary qualities. The first gives the strength to act. The second helps not to turn mercy into arrogance. And believe, material progress is not identical to human progress. The growth of technologies, increased prosperity, improved conveniences do not guarantee a change in a person's inner life and moral orientations. This is a separate axis of development that requires its own attention and conscious work. By material progress, I mean changes in conditions of existence. More goods, access to energy, transport, medicine, infrastructure. By human progress, I mean change of character, development of compassion, honesty, responsibility, willingness to limit one's own desires for the sake of another. These two categories move at different rhythms and by different laws. Material goods change the external environment. Moral qualities are formed in habits, relationships, and daily decisions. Their nature is different, and therefore evaluating human interaction only through the prism of economic indicators is wrong. The mechanisms by which technical and economic growth do not automatically raise the moral level of society are explicable. An increase in resources eases physical needs, but at the same time creates new temptations. Competition for status, expansion of consumption circles, pursuit of convenience at any cost. The psyche adapts to the level of comfort and demands more, which shifts the focus from the inner to the outer.
Social structures oriented toward profit and efficiency form norms in which a person's value is often measured by their usefulness or purchasing power. Thus, attitudes develop that do not stimulate the development of compassion and self-sacrifice. There is also the reverse logic. Material possibilities give space for moral work. When elementary needs are satisfied, there is a chance to engage in education, art, charity, reflection. Free time and access to information create opportunities for nurturing the heart. This resource in itself does not solve the problem. It merely provides prerequisites. For goods to lead to moral growth, a conscious culture, moral practices, and institutions that value not only profit but also human dignity are required. The limits of trust in technical tools and economic metrics should be clearly marked. Measures of well-being based on quantitative indicators miss qualities that are hard to count. Respect, fidelity, capacity for compassion. These qualities do not submit to rules of optimization or algorithms of efficiency. Rising production indicators do not capture the thinning of social trust or the growth of loneliness. One cannot rely on external improvements as a substitute for moral education and personal work on oneself. Culture and education become key mediators between material and human development. Schools, families, and communities must pay attention to forming habits that strengthen empathy and the will for justice. Technical advantages provide tools for transmitting knowledge and widening horizons, but they do not by themselves nurture character.
Upbringing requires repeatable practices, responsibility for one's actions, the ability to endure small deprivations for a greater goal, the skill of hearing and accepting another's pain. These exercises are easy to arrange in a society with sufficient material means, but the program will not start without a deliberate cultural choice. Economic structures and political institutions carry their own role in the fate of moral development. Market rules and bureaucratic logic form incentives and sanctions. If incentives are directed only at profit growth, people's behavior is rearranged to meet those demands. For material improvement to be accompanied by growth in humanity, institutions are needed that encourage justice, include mechanisms of solidarity, and create space for responsibility. This is not an automatic process, but the result of political and moral choice by society. Practical decisions depend on where the boundary is drawn between what is called progress. Progress becomes full when it includes criteria that measure the quality of relationships and the inner state of people. These criteria cannot be substituted by economic indices. One must ask, how much warmth remains in relationships after technical innovations? How much room is left for simple human duties? How much readiness there is to share another's misfortune? It is such questions that move the discussion of development out of one-sided descriptions into the field of moral demand. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy constantly returned to the idea that the growth of material well-being does not solve the problem of inner transformation. He saw that external conveniences can serve as a mask for the absence of love and honesty. In his thought, work and simplicity act as means of shaping character, as a counterbalance to the habit of equating progress with success. Tolstoy speaks of a demand on life that goes beyond statistics and requires evaluation of the human heart. I ask you to pose the question of your own scale of progress. Should your perception of success credit only what is visible in accounts and things, or is it important what remains in deeds and relationships when technology is silent and conveniences disappear? Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy calls for attention to the inner state and responsibility for the person you become in a world that constantly changes its outward appearance. Herein lies the challenge of our time, to turn material achievements into support for human growth, not into its replacement.
Suffering appears as one of the most acute moral problems. It breaks plans, takes away strength, raises the question of life's meaning and justice. Many experience pain as an event to be either overcome, hidden, or explained in a chain of causes and effects. This way of reacting leaves unanswered the main moral question: how suffering transforms a person inwardly and affects their ability to live honestly and love. In Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy's understanding, suffering is not reducible to biological pain or accidental tragedy. It is capable of serving as a test that places a choice before the personality. The criterion that allows judging the value of suffering is directly linked to the change of soul and deeds. Suffering acquires moral significance when it causes a person to refrain from former attachments, to lessen pride, to develop the capacity for compassion and responsibility.
This criterion cannot be measured by scales or external successes. It is seen in everyday discipline, in small habits of acting differently than before, in the willingness to share another's pain. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy placed inner change above external proofs, because only the heart determines whether suffering became purification or merely torment. If suffering works according to this criterion, the consequences appear in changed relationships and life practices. A person who has undergone purification becomes less dependent on recognition and comforts. They more often view the world through the lens of responsibility toward others. A steadfastness arises that is not equal to harshness, but akin to humility, the ability to endure difficulties without embitterment, the skill of hearing another's pain and acting. In a community, such changes manifest as increased mutual aid, a shift of priorities from the personal to the common, and one important result: a reduced readiness to justify offense and violence for the sake of gain. When suffering does not lead to an inner reordering, the consequences are different and noticeable by other signs. Pain experienced as a meaningless defeat often intensifies isolation and alienation, cultivates cynicism or a deep vulnerability that closes a person off from the world. In these cases, suffering does not purify, but cements previous vices, makes a person more attentive to their own pain and less willing to share another's. Such an effect has political and social consequences. Conflicts multiply, distrust grows, and willingness to sacrifice for the common good decreases. The boundary of applying the idea of purifying suffering must be clearly delineated. One cannot assume that any suffering automatically leads to personal growth. The semantic boundary runs where suffering serves as a justification for evil, coercion, or violence. In a society where suffering is distributed unjustly, and where some suffer for the profit of others, the idea of purification does not work and can become an instrument of moralizing rather than a path to moral renewal. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy did not elevate suffering into a cult of suffering. He demanded that through pain, a person become freer from pride and stronger in love, not more cruel or passive. Rethinking suffering requires active work on attention to the motives and results of one's experiences. Inner examination helps to understand whether through pain, the capacity to be useful to others is ripening. Labor and the discipline of everyday actions become a practical continuation of this insight. Good habits consolidate changes, while the habit of justifying oneself continues to destroy them. Such an approach requires honesty with oneself and readiness to patiently change one's way of life in accordance with new feelings and convictions. Public policy and the moral cultivation of the community influence how suffering is processed into strength or into destruction. If institutions support unbreakable solidarity, if education teaches responsibility, and habits of life encourage mutual aid,
then individual pain more often leads to common growth. Otherwise, the power of suffering is used for manipulation and the consolidation of power through fear. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy saw in this a threat to moral development and insisted that social arrangements be organized so that suffering is reduced and becomes a fruitful basis for love.
You can test the personal acceptability of this idea by a simple observation. Has your view of another changed after the trial you went through? Has your life become more ready for service and responsibility? If an inner diminution of ego was accompanied by practical steps, this is a sign that suffering worked as purification. If there are no changes, it is important not to idealize pain, but to think about other paths to educating the heart, about knowledge and practices that will help develop the necessary habits without a preliminary catastrophe. The ethical boundary also concerns interference in others' suffering. One must not use the idea of purification as an argument for leaving a person in distress for the sake of their useful trial. The moral duty is to reduce suffering, provide help, and eliminate the causes of injustice. Tolstoy linked moral growth with active compassion, not with contemplation of pain. It is this emphasis that separates sincere work on oneself from cruel self-assertion through experiencing others' misfortunes. In the religious philosophical aspect, suffering appears as a call to pay attention to spiritual life. For many, this call means a search for meaning, a reassessment of values, a return to simplicity, and to love as a constant practice. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy proposed not to follow fashionable theories about the purpose of suffering, but to be guided by real changes in oneself and in one's attitude to others. The ethical meaning of suffering is revealed when it becomes a door to mercy, and mercy to the reduction of causes of new pain. Going beyond the limits of this principle is possible and obvious. If suffering justifies power, if it amends social inequality, or is used as a moral exam for the weak, then speaking of its purifying power is meaningless. The moral criterion remains key and simple. Suffering is valuable when it leads to greater compassion and to responsibility for one's neighbor. This requirement was formulated and substantiated by Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy, insisting that trials have no independent aesthetic or moral value if they do not transform a person toward love and honesty. Education functions as a mechanism for forming the soul through successive inner transformations. It creates conditions in which a child and an adult receive guides for behavior, train their will, and form habits. These guides arise not only from what is taught in textbooks, but from routine actions, conversations, daily schedules, the example of elders, and the community's evaluations. Through repetition of concrete acts, through the practice of helping one's neighbor, and through demands for honesty, a propensity to act according to conscience is formed. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy saw education precisely as such a mechanism. A school should not so much accumulate knowledge as produce moral reflexes that themselves become the support for actions in difficult situations. The mechanism includes several interrelated elements. The first element is the selection of goals and priorities in the curriculum. If emphasis is placed on character development, not only on technical skills, then every lesson becomes an opportunity to work on patience, respect, and responsibility. The second element is the method of transmitting knowledge. Explaining facts and discussing moral dilemmas engage both reason and feeling simultaneously, and this links knowledge with empathy. The third element is the social environment. A peer group
teacher, family traditions consolidate norms through approval or condemnation, through joint deeds and the sharing of joy and labor. The fourth element is labor practice. Physical work as part of education. Working with one's hands disciplines, reduces narcissism, and teaches responsibility for outcomes. Each of these elements, as part of a unified mechanism, supports the growth of conscience and the ability to love one's neighbor in practice. Why this is necessary now and always. Education turns abstract moral demands into a living ability to choose rightly in concrete life. Conscience is formed not in words, but in successive actions under the control of a conscientious environment. If a person knows how to solve a math problem, but has not been taught to restrain anger, to help the weak, or to admit a mistake, their knowledge will not do good for society. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy believed that without moral education, people remain technically literate but morally powerless. Education oriented toward the heart reduces the conflict between social duties and personal gain, because an internal habit of honesty becomes an impulse to act even in situations where no external control is possible. The mechanism is also necessary for the stability of society. When the educational system steadily supports honesty, willingness to work, and care for one's neighbor, public institutions are less prone to corruption and violence. In this sense, school and home are the first line of defense against moral degradation. Habits formed in childhood determine probable reactions to authority, conflicts, and temptations. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy insisted on educating the heart as a way to prevent mass errors and justifications of evil. The point where the mechanism breaks lies in the mismatch between the clear goals and actual practices. When the formal program proclaims morality, but the behavior of teachers and parents demonstrates other values, the student absorbs contradictory signals. An exaggerated orientation toward grades turns a pursuit of knowledge into a race for a number, where honesty is set aside in favor of results at any cost. An institutional emphasis on competition turns a school into an arena of individualism, where sympathy and cooperation turn out to be marginal. Professorial or parental habits of hypocrisy undermine trust in moral words more than any theory. The mechanism also breaks through the detachment of education from bodily and practical life. If learning becomes a dry transmission of abstract knowledge without labor practice, the child will not learn to connect effort with result and responsibility with the common good. The gap between academic activity and real work generates the impression that morality is decoration, not a demand for action. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy emphasized the importance of labor as a means of forming character. Without it, the educational mechanism loses its support, and moral skills become ephemeral. Often the mechanism is broken by the absence of a stable community in which virtues can be practiced. If the family breaks up, schools are overloaded and have no time for upbringing, and public institutions encourage consumption and personal gain, then systemic influence on character fades. Public ceremonies and formal rituals do not replace daily practice of kindness. Where adult behavior demonstrates a readiness to use force for the sake of a goal, children learn to justify cruelty and manipulation. This failure manifests in mass practices that cement insensitivity and calculation. A small example of a personal plan. If a school introduces mandatory gardening and students together grow vegetables for a charitable canteen, they gain a direct connection between labor, care for others, and result. This simple practice works more powerfully than long moral lectures and turns the abstract idea of care into a concrete skill of sharing. Where the mechanism of power and control breaks, education becomes an instrument of manipulation. A system that evaluates people by obedience and uses upbringing to entrench the status quo suppresses the development of conscience. In such conditions, students remember how to act according to instructions, but do not learn to hear their inner voice and do not acquire the critical skills that protect against submission to evil. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy criticized any form of education that serves the interests of power and the expense of personality development. The conclusion is that education as moral upbringing works when it combines four things: the sincere example of adults, constant practice of responsible labor, teaching through experience and conversation about meaning, and public support for habits of kindness. If one of the links is missing, the mechanism fails and yields results in the form of formal literacy without heart. For you, this means a simple task: to check which habits you support around you. Become the adult whose example matters more than words. Help create conditions where children do tasks for the common good, where mistakes are acknowledged and corrected, where labor is not hostile but binds people together. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy proposed education as the art of life, and the modern meaning of that proposal is simple and demanding: to teach so that the heart grows stronger and the world becomes more humane. How can literature educate the soul, and what is its real moral power? Art is a way of conveying feelings, and literature is especially subtle in this matter. It does not explain academically, it infects with feeling. Through the word, a shared emotion arises. It becomes a norm of experience for the reader. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy saw art as a means of uniting people in a single experience, as a way to make another's pain one's own, and through that to change behavior. What matters is not an abstract idea, but the immediate experience that remains in the body and later manifests in action. The mechanism of such upbringing is simple in composition and complex in effect. The word creates a scene. The scene creates participation. Participation forms a habit of seeing another as a person. The image of a hero and his path make the heart respond, and discussion of that response consolidates it as a moral support. Language works as a vehicle of feeling. A precise word, a concrete detail, a careful situation. All this holds attention and translates empathy from a one-time experience into a stable propensity to act differently. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy believed it more important to convey experience than to display a clever thought. The form of literature determines its educative power. Simplicity and clarity make the message accessible, and accessibility means that the experience reaches different people and helps build a common moral feeling. A complex technique for the sake of effect loses its purpose if it turns experience into a decorative device. The author's sincerity is the main criterion of value. The authenticity of experience is felt by the reader and becomes a measure for them. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy insisted that art should be understandable and living, and considered this a condition of moral effectiveness. The role of the author is not to demonstrate skill, but to bear responsibility for the feelings they evoke. The choice of scene, attitude toward characters, the degree of detail, all this decides which emotions will be consolidated. A reader learns emotional reactions the same way they learn skills, through repetition, through empathy. I notice that texts that remain in memory are most often those where the emotion is simple and strong, where the author does not hide their attitude behind decorative verbiage. It was precisely this approach that made literature, for Tolstoy, a form of moral education. The reason art influences morals is that feelings precede reason in motivating action. The structure of this influence can be described as a process of transmitting experience through an image and testing that experience in communication with others. The consequences are expressed in a changed attitude to one's neighbor, in a different perception of responsibility, and in readiness to act differently in real life. The boundaries of such influence are clear. The power of the word is limited. It awakens an aspiration that needs to be transformed into habit and into public practices for a stable result.
Literature becomes education of the soul when it is discussed and lived through together. Reading alone is important, but collective analysis, discussion of characters' motivations, open conversation about what moved or disturbed you make the experience educational. School can use this as a tool for forming moral reflexes, and this is precisely how Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy imagined the role of art. He saw the link between text and educational work, between experience reading and the formation of sensitive habits. There is also a danger. When art turns into an instrument of manipulation, it consolidates prejudices and justifies cruelty. Propaganda and calculated techniques whose aim is to produce an effect at any cost form stable reactions that serve other people's interests. In such conditions, literature loses its ability to educate the soul and becomes a technique for managing emotions. That is why a critical attitude toward the source of feelings is no less important than the feeling itself. Practical responsibility is divided among the author, the teacher, and the reader. The author is responsible for the honesty of the feelings evoked, the teacher for organizing the experience so that it leads to moral reflection, the reader for the readiness to be vulnerable and allow oneself to change views under the influence of sincere text. You can learn to read differently, to sense not only the plot, but also what feelings it awakens, to track how these feelings affect your judgment of people and actions. This attention becomes an educative practice. The boundary of art's influence passes through action. Literature educates the soul and attunes the heart to good. But this attunement requires continuation in deeds, in habits, and in public life. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy proposed art as a way to unite people through shared experience. And afterward, one should live in accordance with the feeling that art awakened. The completion of the task lies in giving feelings form in actions. Then art will justify its educative purpose. Practice can take different forms. Lessons that analyze not only plot, but the inner world of the hero teach how to distinguish motives and consequences. Reflection in a journal, theatrical enactments, joint discussion, and social projects inspired by what was read translate experience into action. It is important that discussion does not degenerate into moralizing. Teachers' questions should prompt searching, not ready-made answers. The author remains an example of honesty, and the teacher, a guide who helps readers recognize manipulations and choose empathy over judgment. The moral power of literature lies in its slow, careful effect. It forms the taste of the soul, resilience to facile answers, and the ability to see another whole. This is work that requires patience and honesty from all participants. If reading becomes a habit of kind attention, and if experiences find expression in concrete deeds, then the word will indeed educate the heart, and society will change toward human harmony. Literature will not replace actions, but without it, actions lose depth. To read means to learn to see, to feel, and to respond to the world with love. The consequence of how society perceives marriage, as a formality or as a set of roles, appears in the fact that the home ceases to be a space of moral labor
and turns into an arena of habits that do not nourish inner growth. Children adopt rituals without meaning. Partners live according to a schedule of duties, and the opportunity for joint spiritual development slips away. This leads to a persistent poverty of feeling, to people learning to survive next to each other, but not learning to love in a way that requires changes in character and behavior. As a result, family relationships lose the educational function they could hold for the individual and for society. Where does such a state of affairs come from? The reason lies in that institutional forms of marriage are often subordinated to external norms, image, legal and economic structures, traditions written apart from how people feel and develop. When external order dictates the rhythm of life more strongly than inner responsibility, priority is given to rule observance instead of conscience development. Couples stop discussing the meaning of shared life. Their conversations drift into domestic topics, and deep work on oneself and on the relationship is postponed or delegated to society. Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy saw in this a threat to the moral condition of the person. Understanding marriage as a field of moral formation, where questions of fidelity to oneself and to one's neighbor are decided. A clarification is needed to understand what exactly is meant by a rethinking of marriage and family. It is not about formal changes in law or modifications of rights, but about a shift of emphasis from performance of roles to the development of inner responsibility. This means a conscious choice of honesty in words and deeds, a striving for transparency of motives, a willingness to work on one's faults for the common cause, so that love is not only a feeling, but becomes a criterion for actions. Rethinking includes aligning everyday life with moral convictions, discussing goals for raising children, redistributing duties so that every action supports the education of conscience rather than merely sustaining comfort. Such an approach requires constant self-observation and the courage to admit one's mistakes. The connection with the thoughts of Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy is evident in how he understood the demand of love toward one's neighbor. Tolstoy believed that true love is manifested in the requirement to act in ways that make it easier for the other to live and grow. This demand calls into question many domestic assumptions, because it asks to consider every household choice as a moral act. For Tolstoy, the family is not a closed club of habits, but a school of morality, where one learns patience, sincerity, and responsibility. He emphasized that without such education of the soul, any external successes lose depth. Considering the practical elements of such a revision is important, even without specific prescriptions. One must speak of transparency of motives in conversations between spouses, of attention to which habits sustain the respect and dignity of each person. Attention should be paid to raising children as a process of forming conscience, not only skills and knowledge. Joint labor, allocated with regard for personal development, turns household actions into educational lessons. Attention to small decisions and their moral consequences turns the home into a laboratory of moral practice, where every act serves an educating purpose. Inner work requires certain limits and boundaries. One cannot expect instant results, because character changes slowly and through suffering. Accepting responsibility for one's own weaknesses and working on them complicates life in the short term, but creates conditions for deep transformation. Social attitudes, relatives' habits, and economic circumstances impose limits on freedom of choice. So revising the family also requires social support for those forms of life that allow people to choose honesty and simplicity as a way of life. The role of moral teachers in this process does not reduce to giving instructions. Pedagogy within the family frees the potential of the person when parents' examples correspond to their words. Leo Tolstoy repeatedly returned to the idea that harmony between conviction and way of life is a necessary condition of upbringing. He showed how contradictions between proclaimed morals and everyday deeds destroy trust and undermine authority. Therefore, attention to aligning words and deeds becomes a practical step toward restoring the educative power of the family. The conclusion is as follows. A reassessment of marriage and the family is a shift of priorities from external structure to inner responsibility, a translation of domestic practices into moral exercises, and the conscious cultivation of conscience in every member of the community. Leo Tolstoy proposes considering family life as constant work on oneself, as a field where love is tested by deed. You can begin to look at the home as a school of the heart, where every action matters for the formation of goodness. It is precisely such a shift that makes the family a source of moral strength, capable of transforming society step by step. When authority resolves the problem of discipline exclusively through the threat of physical coercion, this is an expression of a specific political logic. The state issues a rule, is ready to apply force to enforce it, and delegates the right to violence to services it pays to maintain order. In such a situation, decisive is not persuasion or inner consent, but the ability to coerce by means of weapons, arrests, punishments. This particular case shows how the character of relations between ruler and person changes. They cease to be relations of moral influence and become relations of subordination for the sake of maintaining external order. The reasons and structure of this practice are simple. The state system most often strives for stability and manageability. To achieve these goals, institutions are created that concentrate the means of coercion. The mechanism consists in coercion becoming the norm in resolving conflicts, and the law strengthening the right to apply force in the form of sanctions. The consequences are obvious. The moral responsibility of individuals is blurred, conscience recedes to the background, and the legitimacy of power begins to rest on fear and habit. These consequences lead to a cooling of moral demands within society and to the loss of the idea of power as a service to the common good. One can draw a brief conclusion from the particular case. When the state leans on violence as the primary means of enforcement, it loses its moral basis. This is not an abstract hypothesis. Leo Tolstoy interprets power through the prism of the moral fullness of the person. He regards the use of force as the antinomy of that love and conscience that make a person truly free. For Tolstoy, moral authority does not arise from the right to dispose of other people's bodies. It is born of the ability to persuade and to evoke recognition of conscience. Extending the observation to a general rule, one can say, any political system that places coercion at the center of its legitimation risks replacing the moral foundations of authority with mechanisms of governance. Leo Tolstoy defended the idea that power gains right only when its actions are in accord with the inner voice of people, with their conscience and love of neighbor. If the appeal to conscience is erased and only force remains, power ceases to be a moral institution and becomes a machine for maintaining order for self-preservation. It is important here to clarify the limits of such a generalization. To claim that all forms of state regulation are equal in their moral cost would be an oversimplification. Some functions of the state serve as a safe organizational framework for social life and facilitate cooperative activity in conditions of dense interaction. The limitation of Tolstoy's principle is that refusal of force requires, in parallel, the presence of alternative mechanisms capable of organizing cooperation without coercion. Otherwise, an attempt to immediately remove the state from the practice of using force may produce chaos and new forms of repression that are equally alien to morality. How then to connect this general idea with practice? On the one hand, it should be recognized that reducing the role of violence in governance is possible through strengthening moral culture and developing institutions of voluntary regulation. Leo Tolstoy drew attention to the necessity of cultivating conscience, to the role of personal responsibility, to the influence of moral example. These elements create the ground in which collective decisions are made on the basis of recognition of shared moral norms, not on the basis of threat of punishment. On the other hand, there are structural obstacles: economic interdependence, social stratification, historical legacies of violence. These circumstances limit the speed and depth of transformations. Consequently, any movement toward societies in which power loses its reliance on coercion will require a combination of educational work and institutional reform. It is a question of the gradual reduction of state functions that rely on violence, together with strengthening self-government, community responsibility, and mechanisms of peaceful conflict resolution. I draw attention to another technical detail. A moral reorientation of power is impossible without a clear understanding of the role of the individual in political life. Tolstoy pointed out that the public good is composed of countless personal acts of love and conscience. Supporting such acts implies changing laws, norms, and practices so that they encourage participation, sympathy, and responsibility, not only obedience. This requires a different approach to education, to the economy, and to social policy, where the task of power is to create conditions for moral growth, not to replace it with its coercive logic. The limits of the application of Tolstoy's critique are also important for understanding its force. Calls for a complete rejection of state coercion risk overlooking the fact of conflicts of interest in which violence is used to harm specific people. Tolstoy himself acknowledged that personal morality does not instantly and automatically create public mechanisms capable of replacing force. Therefore, the demand to reduce the role of violence must go hand in hand with practical preparation of institutions and society for responsibility. Otherwise, vulnerable groups will be left without protection. To sum up, the particular case of the state's reliance on violence demonstrates a mechanism that devalues the moral legitimacy of authority. In general, this leads to the conclusion that force does not give right, but deprives power of its spiritual foundation. The limitation of this conclusion lies in the need to combine the idea with real steps for cultivating conscience and restructuring institutions. If you reflect on political power and its justification, consider this problem through the prism of inner responsibility and the search for ways to reduce dependence on coercion. Leo Tolstoy proposes keeping the person as bearer of conscience at the center of attention, and in that choice lies the meaning of the move toward politics in which power serves rather than rules. Civil disobedience is a duty to refuse to participate in evil when participation becomes a requirement of the system. The rule is simple. If a law or order forces you to perform actions that contradict your inner sense of responsibility, you are obliged to refrain from participation and to openly disobey that order. Leo Tolstoy believed that a person's moral status is higher than formal authority, and it is precisely inner irreconcilability with another's injustice that makes disobedience a demand of conscience. Tension arises from the calculated rigidity of the social fabric. On the one hand, law sets order. On the other, it can prescribe behavior that destroys another's life or dignity. This configuration produces persecution of those who refuse to submit. Fear for freedom, for family, for livelihoods presses on the will, and the pressure often proves stronger than convictions. Leo Tolstoy pointed to the price of personal refusal. The willingness to endure punishment becomes the measure of morality.
Additional tension is hidden in moral uncertainty. Sometimes rules seem justified, and pointing out their cruelty requires time and effort to think through. People get used to obeying orders gradually and do not notice the stages of degradation. Under the pressure of everyday practices and routine demands, conscience fades, and the ability to notice evil weakens. This erosion of moral sensitivity complicates the moment of choice, making it painful and isolating. The causes of this phenomenon and social mechanisms are clear. Belief in authority, fear of punishment, and economic dependence serve as incentives to obedience. The structure of the process consists of the distribution of responsibility and the social normalization of practices. The effectiveness of power rests on the division of roles and on the rituals of execution. The consequences are predictable. Individual conscience dissolves into the system. Evil becomes entrenched as the norm, and public morality declines. Leo Tolstoy saw this mechanism and emphasized the need to return responsibility to the personal level in order to break chains of unconscious participation in evil. Further, tension shifts into the field of tactics and ethics of action. Civil disobedience is associated with the risk of escalation. Refusal can provoke a harsh response, reprisals, tightening control, which in turn will bring suffering to others. The decision to remain faithful to conscience requires readiness for consequences, and at the same time, attention to ensuring that one's own act does not cause greater harm than the existing order. This balance is difficult, and it raises the question of how to act responsibly in conditions of conflict. Another tension concerns collectivity. An individual refusal changes little if it is not supported by others. Mass disobedience requires organization, trust, and shared moral orientations. At the same time, organization must not turn into a new form of coercion. To withstand this risk means preserving transparency of intentions, openness of arguments, and constant return to each participant's personal responsibility. Resolution of this tense situation is possible through a set of practical principles. First, strict adherence to nonviolence and refusal to cause harm as a means of achieving goals. Second, readiness to bear the consequences of one's actions publicly and honestly, to show the truthfulness of one's motivation. Third, maximum openness and explanation of one's position so that the appeal to the conscience of others is clear and accessible. Fourth, formation of mutual aid and self-governing institutions that reduce dependence on coercion. Leo Tolstoy emphasized that moral protest must be both a personal act and a social project. Practical resolution requires work on 3 levels. At the individual level, one must develop the ability to hear the inner voice and train the readiness to take responsibility for consequences. At the local level, communities must create mechanisms of protection and support for those who refuse to participate in harm. At the institutional level, alternative practices should be created that replace coercive functions with mechanisms of trust and responsibility. Such a multi-layered approach reduces the risk of chaos and makes refusal sustainable. It is important to understand the limits of this resolution. Refusal to participate in evil cannot be justified if it leads to greater harm for the vulnerable. The decision requires constant assessment of consequences and a tendency toward self-criticism.
In cases where refusal leaves people who depend on existing institutions unprotected, it is necessary to seek ways to mitigate harm and to make collective decisions. Leo Tolstoy proposed viewing moral action as an act of love, where care for one's neighbor remains the measure of every initiative. To close the thought, I stress a simple demand. Civil disobedience is an active ethical choice. It requires courage, transparency, and collective responsibility. You can begin with small steps, but on any scale, it is important to maintain honesty of motive and readiness not to hide the consequences of your actions. Leo Tolstoy leaves a clear guide: conscience and love as criteria of action. Following this guide makes disobedience not a form of rebellion for its own sake, but a moral act capable of changing relations of power and turning society into a community of responsible people. One line of explanation of history is enough to simplify everything into a convenient scheme. Some reduce the past to the will of outstanding individuals, others to impersonal laws of development. Such clarity removes responsibility and offers ready-made recipes for action. This clarity is attractive because it promises control, predictability, and meaning, but it deprives history of the density of causes and human choices that make it an object of moral attention. Broadening the view, one sees a tangle of causes and motives where every strand runs from a private deed, a small habit, a chance encounter. The scale of events is made up of thousands of small things, of a person's fatigue, of a random sleep, of established rituality of actions.
Leo Tolstoy showed that great words about fate and destiny often mask the simple arithmetic of many wills and circumstances. He demanded that we see not the autopilot of history, but its scattered little motors, human habits, fears, calculations, and unexpected impulses. This shift changes the kinds of questions one must ask. Instead of looking for a single explanatory formula, there arises concern for a method of attentiveness: how to collect evidence, how to distinguish motive from justification, how to recognize chains of cause without reducing them to a convenient cliché. Tolstoy pushes toward moral caution. When history becomes a legend with heroes and villains, the moral focus shifts from studying deeds to glorifying the figure. Such glorification facilitates justification of violence and removes the question of who suffered and why. A further turn touches political practice as well. Simple theories make mass mobilization under the slogan of inevitability possible. If everything leads to one goal, any means are permissible. Leo Tolstoy warned against these narratives because they diminish the sense of personal responsibility and create a readiness to sacrifice one's neighbors for abstract interests. Historical thought nurtured in attention to the particular preserves a sense of proportion. It requires checking the cost of each decision and considering the shadow it casts on people's lives. Then comes an understanding of the limits of historical knowledge. History does not become a mathematics. Its regularities are always conditional and situational. Reasonable skepticism toward grand theories is not a denial of understanding, but a way to remain honest before the complexity of the world. Here Leo Tolstoy appears as a moral epistemologist. The meaning of events is measured not only by their large-scale consequences, but by how they resonated in the human heart, in conscience. Skepticism towards simplifications entails practical demands on how we act today. We must learn to hear the small voices of the past and present, to record local effects of decisions, not to close our eyes to those whom grand explanations make invisible.
You have the right to demand that political arguments include an account of real consequences, not only ideological coherence. Such a demand raises the price of every promise and makes public discourse more attentive to people. Finally, a fixation. Tolstoy's philosophical caution becomes a moral principle. Skepticism towards simple historical schemes is a way to protect human responsibility and to preserve moral depth of analysis. It proposes remaining a mediator between the past and action, testing any recipes of historical meaning through the prism of conscience and love of neighbor. Leo Tolstoy reminds us that history serves not to justify days, but to learn to see consequences and to bear them before our decisions. This demand for concreteness has simple consequences for education and public culture. In school, one must teach not only dates and laws, but how to compare evidence and show layers of causes. Public discussion will benefit if demands for transparency and accountability become the norm. Politics that can count the cost of each decision in human destinies will be both more honest and more effective. In times of crisis, the temptation to explain everything with one word is especially great. Then, it is important to remind that clarity of argument does not replace kindness of judgment.
A historian who has turned the past into a set of canned lessons deprives us of connection with the real and thereby spoils the possibility of a moral response. Where then is the path Tolstoy offers? It lies in the practice of small deeds, in the demand for honesty of words and deeds, in the readiness to listen to opponents, in the habit of counting the price of suffering. These habits are modest and difficult. They do not allow one to shine, but they prevent errors that cost people their lives. If public institutions begin to measure success not only by the speed of change, but also by the reduction of pain and by the increase in the possibility for people to live with dignity, many abstract projects will cease to be tempting. This is not a utopia of trifles. It is a wager that moral habits determine the scale of possible good. Tolstoy teaches that the great begins not with platforms and decrees, but with careful treatment of one another, with the readiness to acknowledge, I do not know all the consequences of my action. Such an approach does not guarantee an easy choice, but it reduces the likelihood that the choice will be heartless. That is why the conversation about right and responsibility must be practical. Discuss not abstract principles, but real procedures, ways of compensation, mechanisms of control. Then the discussion will gain flesh. Who and how pays for mistakes? How to restore trust? Which institutions are able to detect the side effects of power? This is not a conversation about stopping change, but about shaping it in a way that preserves human dignity. Accepting this view means changing everyday life, taking steps that reduce harm, demanding clear reports from power, learning to admit mistakes and to correct them. It is patient and inconspicuous work, but if pursued persistently, it will change the structure of the possible and create a society where the word inevitability does not serve as a cover for cruelty. This is the path of reforms. Strengthen institutions, protect the rights of the vulnerable, develop solidarity, and learn to see the consequences of ideas daily. Work is a form of moral exercise. When hands and mind are engaged in the same action, motivation receives immediate feedback, and honesty turns from an abstract demand into a practical habit. The mechanics are simple. Manual labor shows the consequences of an action immediately and visibly. If you cut a part poorly, the chair will collapse. If you plow the ground badly, the shoots will be sparse. If a liar
cannot lie properly, the lie, sooner or later, will be revealed in the work. This simplicity of verification disciplines the will. It forces one to care about quality, because quality is not just a word, but a tangible reality you can touch. Leo Tolstoy, in his notes and in life, repeatedly returned to descriptions of work where a person meets the limits of their strength and at the same time learns responsibility. A carpenter who spends the whole evening fitting a tenon immediately feels what it means to be accountable for his work. From this mechanism, a short conclusion follows. Labor educates honesty through the connection of action and result. When that connection is blurred, excuses are convenient and responsibility evaporates. When the consequences are material, one must make decisions so as to do less harm to oneself and others. This education is not formal. It is subtle and slow. The habit of caring about the work becomes the habit of caring for the people whose lives are affected by your actions.
A concomitant effect is tied to corporality and attention. Manual labor requires presence, demanding attention to the material and conditions. Attention of this kind cultivates patience and humility before the reality of things. It makes mindless rhetoric impossible, because words without deeds quickly lose authority. This kind of discipline reduces the tendency toward empty verbal display and develops respect for other people's crafts. Leo Tolstoy saw in work a way to gain inner clarity, not merely a means of subsistence. He believed that honesty in one's work imprints moral bearings more strongly than theories read in books. The reasons, structure, and consequences of this practice can be laid out more clearly. Reason. The separation of intellect from practical responsibility makes morality abstract. Structure. Inclusion in education and daily life of craft practice, where a pupil observes their mistakes and corrects them under the supervision of more experienced people. Consequences. A habit of being answerable for results develops, the tendency to excuse oneself diminishes, and empathy grows for those who bear the consequences of others' decisions. This set explains why societies in which labor is esteemed and integrated into upbringing more often preserve honesty in public affairs. In those conditions, Tolstoy saw a path to restoring the ties between word and deed. At the same time, it is important to define the limits of this prescription. Labor in itself is not an automatic means of salvation. Physical labor can be oppressive and degrading if it is imposed without choice and without a fair distribution of benefits. Work turned into a trial for the oppressed does not cultivate dignity, but entrenches dependency. Moreover, labor does not replace systemic justice. Honest habits of individuals will not rid society of structural inequality. Political and economic mechanisms must be combined with moral exercise. Otherwise, the efforts of individuals are devalued. I note this because admiration for labor must not blind one to the ways in which labor can be used to sustain power and exploitation. The practical consequences for education and public life are concrete. Schools and institutions should include manual work in their curricula, not as a formality, but as a required element of character formation. Work in workshops, joint projects for improving common spaces, and rural practicums give a student a sense of responsibility for the common good and instill the habit of thinking about consequences. In the public sphere, this means respect for professions that create the material basis of society and the revision of the prestige criteria. If you often encounter situations where decisions are made by those who have never seen the results of their orders in practice, consider how including them in work changes the quality of judgment. The connection with Leo Tolstoy's moral project is obvious and multi-layered. Tolstoy maintained that a simple life and labor purify the heart. He saw in work a means of diminishing pride and increasing sensitivity to the suffering of one's neighbor.
His experience of living in the countryside, engaging in crafts and household cares, served as an example of how practice changes the inner relation to the world. Tolstoy did not propose a mechanical recipe. He proposed a way of life in which word and action agree, and where honesty manifests in everyday duties.
One more practical stroke. The problem of alienation. In the modern division of labor requires institutional solutions. Bureaucratic and financial activities detached from technical and productive bases need feedback channels that could return a sense of responsibility to those who make decisions. This might look like mandatory internships for managers, work in the fields of workshops for humanities students, or a rotation system that allows one to understand the consequences of political decisions at the level of practice. Such embedding of labor practice into educational and managerial trajectories helps reduce the risk of mistakes made out of ignorance of real consequences. In your personal life, you can also apply this principle. Find a task with your hands that requires patience and responsibility. Set yourself the goal of bringing a small thing to completion so that the result honestly reflects the effort invested. This is not necessarily a radical change of fate. It is an exercise that corrects inner motivation and changes your relation to the promises you make to others. Tolstoy believed that it is precisely such small trials that form the moral foundation on which the capacity for love and compassion is built. The final conclusion is simple. Work as a moral practice makes morality visible and testable. It moves the demand for honesty from words to deeds. Commitment to this practice requires caution and systemic thinking to avoid turning labor into an instrument of oppression. But if respect for craft is combined with social guarantees and the fair distribution of benefits, labor will become a mechanism that restores humanity to decision-making and strengthens that very connection between word and deed about which Tolstoy wrote so insistently. Cruelty to animals has become a systemic problem of moral consciousness. Industrial production, eating habits, and entertainments have created a situation in which the pain of other sentient beings is detached from everyday responsibility. This severance appears in decisions made by economic categories of efficiency and profit, rather than by moral assessment of suffering. As a result, animal suffering becomes a statistic, a product, a stage in a technological process, and humanity is confined to isolated acts of regret, rather than to a sustained normal behavior. The criterion for evaluating such a state is simple and strict. Compassion as a practical rule of conduct. Compassion implies the ability to take into account another's experience when choosing actions and organizing life so as to prevent or minimize harm. For this criterion to cease being an abstraction, it must become a guide for everyday choices, a way of educating both emotions and reason simultaneously. Tolstoy wrote about love and non-harm as an inner law that demands concrete changes in lifestyle. Love that does not manifest in deeds remains rhetoric. Compassion translates word into practice. It tests convictions by action. The consequences of adopting compassion as a criterion are deep. On a personal level, it changes habits of eating, leisure, and consumption. Everyday decisions acquire moral weight. Choosing a product, buying clothes, attending events become tests of the ability to notice another's pain. In the public sphere, this affects norms and institutions. Standards for the keeping of animals, bans or restrictions on dangerous practices, regulation of the entertainment and agricultural industries. The economic order begins to be reassessed through the lens of ethics.
because production that ignores suffering bears external moral costs. Tolstoy linked a person's inner integrity with the external rules of society. When private values coincide with legal standards, society rests on a firmer moral foundation. How exactly to translate the criterion into practice is both an organizational and a psychological question. One must form moral perception from childhood, introduce knowledge that animals feel, and teach taking responsibility for the consequences of one's actions. Public policy can support this process through education, incentives for humane production, and transparency in supply chains. On the economic level, restructuring is possible. Support for farmers willing to switch to more gentle methods, investment in alternative technologies, tax and subsidy mechanisms that make ethical choices accessible. For such changes to stick requires a combination of personal discipline and institutional architecture. Indeed, applying the criterion of compassion produces a wide range of practical effects. Reducing consumption of animal products lowers demand for cruel practices, stimulates development of plant-based and lab-grown alternatives, and gradually transforms the market. Legislative changes lead to improved conditions for housing and transporting animals, to bans on particularly cruel methods. Culture begins to reassess activities previously considered normal. This affects the prestige of occupations and the behavior of entrepreneurs. Tolstoy believed that moral progress is visible through changes in everyday affairs, and it is precisely these changes that create invisible but sturdy supports for a new attitude toward life. The limit of applying the principle of compassion requires clear analysis of causes, structure of practice, and anticipation of consequences. Cause. Animal suffering is tied to economic interests and habits that are hard to change instantly. Structure of transformation involves a complex of measures: education, economic incentives, legislation, and scientific innovation. Consequences include positive effects for the health of ecosystems and people, as well as the need to reconfigure industries and provide social support for those whose livelihoods depend on old practices. This analytical block shows that compassion does not come without a pragmatic strategy. Steps are needed that take human needs into account and minimize social risks during the transition. It is important to indicate the limits of absolute demands. Compassion does not produce an instant solution to all conflicts between human and animal interests. Questions of survival, ecological balance, and cultural traditions create complex situations where simple prescriptions prove insufficient. In such cases, the criterion remains a guide. Choose options that reduce harm as much as possible and are accompanied by measures to support affected people. Finally, compassion requires honest reflection on one's own motivations and avoidance of moral posturing. Tolstoy emphasized the importance of aligning one's way of life with proclaimed convictions, and this demand extends to one's attitude toward animals. The practical takeaway for you is concrete. Arrange your priorities so that your behavior causes less suffering, and channel your influence into institutions that can scale these changes. Consider what products and services you support and what standards you want to see in society. Tolstoy saw compassion as the moral axis that leads to a more honest, calm, and whole life. Acting in accordance with this principle, you participate in creating a world where respect for life becomes everyday practice and words take shape through deeds. Harmony between what you say and how you live, for Leo Tolstoy, is not an aesthetic whim, but a moral demand. Speech must carry weight, because a word without action loses credibility and destroys a person's inner integrity. Life is considered worthy when convictions manifest in deeds, and deeds nourish convictions, turning morality into a constant practice rather than a temporary disposition. Agreement of life and word means a constant checking of motives and a readiness to pay the price for honesty. It is a daily discipline in which small choices matter more than loud declarations. Speech becomes a guide only if accompanied by habits of working on oneself, by giving up convenient excuses, and by clarity in answering simple questions. What do I support with my purchases? What pain am I willing to lessen? What am I teaching my children? Such practice clears language of rhetoric and restores to it responsibility for the fates of others. The origins of this demand lie in the notion of conscience as an inner tribunal and in the idea of love as a criterion of action. Conscience sets the tone of relations with the world. Love directs the will toward diminishing suffering, and a word born in such a disposition becomes a force that changes the environment. If speech is not confirmed by deed, it loses moral authority and turns into an ornament that conceals weakness of will or fear of change. Tolstoy proposed not abstract correspondence, but practical implantation of sincerity into every sphere of life. One can achieve agreement through simple, regular practices. Honest accounting of one's actions, reducing the desire to cover deeds with words, returning to manual labor as a way to test one's responsibility, cultivating feelings through education and art that form character and not only knowledge. Art that is alive and truthful makes inner order visible. Work with hands and mind strengthens the connection between intention and result. And open speech makes public responsibility possible. The efforts described encounter persistent distortions. Demonstrative righteousness masks weakness. Public declarations serve status rather than change. Moral play turns words into a commodity, traded to gain trust without corresponding actions. Traditions and institutions sometimes preserve only the form of virtue, without supporting its content. Market mechanisms appropriate moral terms and sell them as brands. All these phenomena weaken the bond between word and deed, and create the illusion of morality where there is none. The limits of the demand for agreement are important as well. Life roles impose obligations. Conflicts between interests require complex weighing. Sometimes honesty in one dimension causes harm in another, and absolute adherence to one's word can lead to new sufferings. In such moments, transparent reflection and a readiness to compromise are required, preserving the principle's call, the aspiration to reduce harm and be sincere, without turning morality into a dogma blindly applied in every situation. Social environment and economic conditions affect the possibility of living in agreement with convictions. Education shapes tastes and habits. Markets create accessibility of certain choices. Laws structure possibilities. For words to become deeds, an institutional architecture is needed. Norms that support honest labor, schools where heart education is combined with the mind, economic incentives for those willing to change practices. Without such conditions, personal sincerity often proves helpless against the system. Attaining agreement brings deep consequences. Speech confirmed by deed restores trust between people. A life that speaks the truth reduces inner tension and frees energy for creation. Art that reflects authenticity becomes an educational force. Family and society, where words and actions coincide, create an atmosphere in which it is easier to learn honesty and responsibility. This is not a quick effect, but a slow accumulation of stable moral habits. Putting together a holistic picture, it is clear that the demand for agreement ties many conceptual threads. Conscience sets the measure, love directs the will, non-harm disciplines choices, simplicity frees one from superfluous desires, labor affirms the honesty of actions, and sincerity of speech gives society a foundation of trust. These supporting ideas form a practical technology of life, where theory is constantly tested by practice, and where moral growth is measured by everyday deeds rather than striking words. You have a simple but demanding task. Make your words have a practical continuation in deeds, so that habits confirm convictions and public demands support individual efforts. Start small, align your purchases, work and conversations, take responsibility for consequences, and support institutions that make honest living possible. In this stable agreement lies the Tolstoyan prospect of moral life, where word and deed serve the same truth and the person becomes a whole presence in the world. Good night.
Harmony between what you say and how you live, for Leo Tolstoy, is not an aesthetic whim but a moral demand. Speech must carry weight, because a word without action loses credibility and destroys a person's inner integrity. Life is considered worthy when convictions manifest in deeds, and deeds nourish convictions, turning morality into a constant practice rather than a temporary disposition. Agreement of life and word means a constant checking of motives and a readiness to pay the price for honesty. It is a daily discipline in which small choices matter more than loud declarations. Speech becomes a guide only if accompanied by habits of working on oneself, by giving up convenient excuses, and by clarity in answering simple questions. What do I support with my purchases? What pain am I willing to lessen? What am I teaching my children? Such practice clears language of rhetoric and restores to it responsibility for the fates of others. The origins of this demand lie in the notion of conscience as an inner tribunal and in the idea of love as a criterion of action. Conscience sets the tone of relations with the world. Love directs the will toward diminishing suffering, and a word born in such a disposition becomes a force that changes the environment. If speech is not confirmed by deed, it loses moral authority and turns into an ornament that conceals weakness of will or fear of change. Tolstoy proposed not abstract correspondence, but practical implantation of sincerity into every sphere of life. One can achieve agreement through simple, regular practices. Honest accounting of one's actions, reducing the desire to cover deeds with words, returning to manual labor as a way to test one's responsibility, cultivating feelings through education and art that form character and not only knowledge. Art that is alive and truthful makes inner order visible. Work with hands and mind strengthens the connection between intention and result. And open speech makes public responsibility possible. The efforts described encounter persistent distortions. Demonstrative righteousness masks weakness. Public declarations serve status rather than change. Moral play turns words into a commodity traded to gain trust without corresponding actions. Traditions and institutions sometimes preserve only the form of virtue without supporting its content. Market mechanisms appropriate moral terms and sell them as brands. All these phenomena weaken the bond between word and deed and create the illusion of morality where there is none. The limits of the demand for agreement are important as well. Life roles impose obligations. Conflicts between interests require complex weighing. Sometimes honesty in one dimension causes harm in another, and absolute adherence to one's word can lead to new sufferings. In such moments, transparent reflection and a readiness to compromise are required, preserving the principle's core, the aspiration to reduce harm and be sincere, without turning morality into a dogma blindly applied in every situation. The social environment and economic conditions affect the possibility of living in accordance with one's convictions. Education shapes tastes and habits. Markets create the availability of particular choices. Laws structure opportunities.
For words to become deeds, an architecture of institutions is needed. Norms that support honest work, schools where the cultivation of the heart is combined with the mind, economic incentives for those willing to change practices. Without such conditions, personal sincerity often proves helpless in the face of the system. Achieving consistency has profound consequences. Words backed by deeds restore trust between people. A way of life that speaks the truth reduces inner tension and frees energy for creative activity. Art that reflects authenticity becomes a formative force. Families and societies where words and actions coincide create an atmosphere in which it is easier to learn honesty and responsibility. This is not a quick effect, but a slow accumulation of lasting moral habits. Taken together, the whole picture shows that the demand for consistency links many intellectual threads. Conscience sets the measure. Love guides the will. Not causing harm disciplines choices. Simplicity frees one from unnecessary desires. Work affirms the honesty of actions. And the sincerity of speech gives society a foundation of trust. These supporting ideas form a practical technology of life, where theory is constantly tested by deed and where moral growth is measured by everyday actions rather than impressive words. You face a simple but exacting task. Make sure your words have practical follow-through in your deeds, that habits confirm your convictions, and that social expectations support individual efforts. Start small. Align your purchases, work, and conversations. Take responsibility for the consequences and support the institutions that make honest existence possible.
It is in this stable consistency that the Tolstoyan perspective on moral life lies, where word and deed serve one truth, and the person becomes an integrated presence in the world.